I work at a family-owned hotel in my town. Despite its small, somewhat worn appearance, it attracts decent business. When compared to the big-name hotels in larger cities, we're not much, but there aren't many other options in the area. So, during the summer and winter months, we get a fair number of bookings. It's nothing crazy, but it's enough to keep things running. However, come spring and fall, things slow down. Sometimes we have just a few bookings a night or even no bookings at all. That's what happened last spring. The hotel was quiet, almost eerily so. Only a handful of guests were staying with us, and the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. It was during one of those slow nights when something strange happened. I was working my regular shift from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. when, around 11 p.m., a man walked through the front entrance. He had a large rolling suitcase with him. He looked normal, no signs of distress or anything out of the ordinary. He was polite, soft-spoken, but something about him seemed tired. He looked like he had just gotten off a long flight, or perhaps had been traveling for hours. He asked for a one-night stay, requesting a room on the first floor, at the end of the hallway if possible. While we don't always accommodate such requests, it wasn't a busy night, so I agreed. He thanked me quietly and walked down the hall toward his room. I went back to my usual routine, standing behind the desk, organizing some papers. Minutes later, another man walked in. This one didn't carry any luggage, and while he also appeared tired, he was far less friendly than the first. He almost demanded a room, insisting on being placed next to the man who had just checked in, claiming they were friends traveling together. Normally, guests traveling in groups would check in together, but I couldn't see a reason to question his story. The first man had been kind and polite, and I had no reason to suspect anything unusual. I assigned him the room next to the other man, and he walked off without another word. I tried to shake off a strange feeling that lingered in my chest, but I had no explanation for it. The night was dragging on, and I found myself sitting behind the desk, snacking on my lunch, scrolling through the news on my phone. An hour passed, then the desk phone rang. I stood up, checking the caller ID, only to see a room number, not an outside call. I picked up the phone, expecting to hear a request or question, but instead, I was met with silence. For a brief moment, all I could hear was a faint shuffling sound before the line went dead. I figured it was just an accidental dial or that the guest had changed their mind. But when I checked the room number, I saw it belonged to the first man, the one who had seemed so tired when he checked in. Another few minutes passed, and then a loud thud echoed down the hallway. It was unmistakable, the kind of sound that travels through a building and makes you pause. I stepped around the counter, walking cautiously toward the hall. No one was in sight. There was no obvious source for the noise, but it had sounded like something had either fallen or broken. Something heavy. I went back to the desk and dialed the room number I had just checked. It rang once, twice, then it was rejected. I stared down the hall again, unease creeping into my chest. I couldn't ignore the feeling. If something was wrong, surely they would have called for help by now. But everything was silent. I let it go, convincing myself that I was overreacting. But then, 30 minutes later, I heard footsteps coming down the hallway. I looked up and saw the second man, the less friendly one, walking toward the front desk. He didn't look at me as he approached, just spoke in a flat tone, saying that he needed to leave early. I confirmed his checkout, and he left just as abruptly as he had arrived. I was left with a strange feeling in my gut, a nagging suspicion I couldn't shake. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It was an unsettling night, and I went home with that same feeling lingering in the back of my mind. It wasn't until several days later that I understood why. The man who had checked in first, the kind one, never checked out. We went into his room and found his belongings. His suitcase, clothes, and toiletries. But there was no sign of him, no trace, not even a hint of where he might have gone. We searched the hotel. The second man, who had claimed to be traveling with the first, was nowhere to be found either. We tried tracing his name, the contact information he'd given when he checked in, but it led to nothing. No address, no phone number, nothing that connected him to the real world. It was as though he never existed. The mystery remains unsolved. I still work at the hotel, but the unsettling feeling has never left. The strange events of that night still haunt me, and I can't help but wonder, was the second man involved? If so, how could he have vanished the first man so completely? What happened in that room? Both men are still missing. The police were never able to find any answers. But I think about them every time I walk down that hallway. I can still hear the thud, and I can never forget that strange, shuffling sound on the phone. Maybe I'll never know what really happened that night. But every day, I expect the mystery to find me again. And when it does, I'm not sure I'll be ready. My family would take yearly vacations to a different hotel or resort every summer. It was always me, my wife, and our 2 little boys. For the most part, we spent all of our time at the resort rather than going out to visit other places. It made the trip cheaper since we didn't need to rent a car, and it was just relaxing to stay at a nice place and get away from everyday life. Of course, when we first arrived in the morning, we would all unpack, and the kids immediately wanted to go to the water park. My wife and I would sit on the chairs around the pool while the boys ran off to play with the other kids at the water park, which was right next to the pool. We sat there, enjoying the sun for about 2 hours, before we both decided we should get back to our room to get ready for dinner. I got up and began walking around the water park, looking for the boys. After a few minutes, I found Sam, the older of the 2, and asked him where Alan was. I changed both of their names for privacy reasons. Sam told me that Alan was playing with another kid on the other side of the park. I told Sam we were leaving and to run back to Mom while I went to find Alan. I searched, walking around like an idiot for probably 10 minutes, starting to get nervous. Just when I was about to call out for him again, I finally saw Alan. He was in the back corner, where a few chairs were set up, talking to a small boy who looked about his age. Sitting in the chairs next to them was a couple, seeming to be the boy's parents. I walked up and briefly introduced myself, but they didn't respond except for giving me a slight smile. There was an awkward couple of seconds of silence. Then, I told Alan that we were leaving for dinner and led him back to the hotel. I asked him about who his new friend was, and he said that he was playing with him at the water park, but that was pretty much it. Alan was a pretty talkative kid, so it wasn't out of the ordinary, but then he told me something strange. He said that the boy introduced him to his parents, who then invited him for dinner tonight. I found it really strange that someone would invite a young boy to dinner without even talking to the boy's parents first. I told my wife as soon as we got up to the room, and she was equally worried about it. We ended up going somewhere quick for dinner, and when we got back to the hotel around 5, the kids both seemed pretty exhausted. We were ready to just relax for the rest of the night. We got into the elevator and made our way up to our floor, but as the elevator doors opened, Alan's new friend and his mother were standing there, as if they were waiting for the elevator to go down. As soon as we got out, the mother looked at me with a short smile and asked if Alan could join them for dinner tonight. I briefly looked at my wife, who seemed just as confused and concerned as I was. Then I looked back at the lady. We already had dinner tonight, but maybe we can work something out for tomorrow. Her smile faded as she turned and walked down the opposite hallway, I assumed to their room. I knew both my wife and I thought the same thing, that they had been creepily waiting for us by the elevator the whole time just to ask about dinner. When we got inside our room, we pulled Alan aside and strictly told him not to go near that family without one of us with him. He seemed a bit upset about it, but he agreed. I also pulled Sam aside separately and made sure he knew of the situation and that I wanted him to look after his little brother if we were ever not around. We all took turns showering, then relaxed on the bed and couch for the rest of the night. I was pretty annoyed at how the vacation was going, already stressed out about my child's safety, but I assured myself it would be better tomorrow. Eventually, we all got ready for bed and turned out the lights. There were 2 beds in the room, one for my wife and me, and the other for the 2 boys to share. A few hours into the night, I was shaken awake. I jolted up, guessing I was pretty on edge, and saw Sam next to me, still shaking my arm. "You okay, bud?" I whispered. Sam responded quietly, whispering to me that Alan was talking to someone at the door. I immediately jumped out of bed and turned the corner leading to the front door. From the short glimpse I got before yelling at him, I could tell he was in the process of figuring out how to unlock the door. I could also hear a faint voice on the other side. I sprinted toward him, screaming for him to back away from the door. Alan jumped back, frightened by the volume of my voice. I slammed into the door, hearing footsteps sprinting down the hall as I finished unlocking the door and swung it open. I know I should have just stayed in the room and called for help, but I was in such a rage that all I wanted was to confront the creep. In the hallway, I saw a quick figure of a man turn the corner down the hall towards the elevators. I tried to catch up, but once I turned the corner, there was no sign of him. He wouldn't have had time to take the elevator, so I knew he must have been staying in a room on that floor. After looking around for a few minutes, I ran back to our room and met my wife, who was already awake due to the chaos of the situation. I told her to lock the door as I was going to go to the front desk to inform them of the incident. By the time I got down to the lobby, my adrenaline was starting to fade, and I was trying to calm myself down so I could explain what happened. There was a young woman at the counter that I talked to, and I could tell she had never dealt with a situation like this before. She called a security guard over to talk to me, as well as her manager. After a few minutes of discussion, though, it was clear they couldn't do much about it. They had no security cameras in the hallways, only on the entrances and exits. I didn't have any proof, nor a description of the man at the door or his relation to the parents who had asked about dinner. Obviously, I assumed it was the father of the other boy, but even though I felt certain about the creepy intentions of the parents, I couldn't prove anything. In short, the best they could do was offer a refund for the remaining days, so we had to move to a different resort 30 minutes away. It's a truly terrible feeling as a parent to know that someone was so likely trying to kidnap your child, and yet there is nothing anyone can do about it. I hate knowing that those creepy parents are probably out there right now, trying to lure unsuspecting children into some weird trap of theirs. Those people deserve to rot in prison. What freaks me out the most is the possibility that the boy who was with them could be someone else's missing child, one they now use to lure other innocent children. I worked as a security guard at a large hotel in Las Vegas during my late 20s. The job paid way better than pretty much any other job nearby that I was actually qualified for, but the most annoying part about it was the scheduling and the staff. At the time, the building was having trouble with a lack of staff to cover shifts, so my schedule would be mornings, evenings, or overnights, all randomly throughout the week. It made it really hard to even sleep sometimes, but again, I liked the money. One night, I was working a late evening shift and was stationed at the front desk, talking to 2 of my coworkers. It was around 11 p.m., and my shift was set to end at midnight, so we were just passing the time. In the middle of our conversation, the phone on the desk rang. I glanced at the number on the screen. It was from one of the rooms in the hotel. I picked up the receiver and asked, "How can I help you?" A man spoke, his voice frantic. "There's something going on in one of the rooms down the hall, and I'm really worried about it." I asked him to explain what was happening, but his response was rushed and panicked. "I can't really explain it. Just get up here. Quick, please. I'm really nervous." I checked the room number on the display, then told him I would send security right up. Of course, I was referring to myself when I said that. I put the phone down quickly and turned to explain the situation to my coworkers. I headed to the elevators, feeling a strange unease settle in my stomach as I made my way to the mid-level floor where the caller had said the room was located. As I walked down the hallway, An overwhelming silence hung in the air. I had expected to hear something, anything, loud noises, commotion, anything that would confirm the caller's story. But there was nothing. The silence felt unnatural, almost oppressive. There was no sign of the caller either. I had half expected him to be standing by the door, waiting for me. But the door was closed. I knocked on the door loudly, announcing hotel security, but there was no answer. I waited for a minute, listening intently, but all I could hear was the soft hum of the air conditioning. A sense of foreboding grew stronger by the second. I walked to the end of the hallway, trying to clear my mind, then turned around and knocked again. Just as I was about to turn back and reconsider what to do next, the door behind me creaked open. An older woman appeared and asked if I was security. I confirmed that I was and inquired if she knew anything about strange noises or the call from the room. Her response was unsettling. "We heard loud noises down the hallway a few minutes ago," she said, her voice trembling. "But we're not sure where it came from." Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. It was clear that whatever had happened, it had frightened her deeply. At this point, my nerves were on edge, and I began to feel a deep unease about the entire situation. I grabbed my walkie-talkie and radioed the front desk, asking them to call the room again and let me know if anyone answered. After what felt like an eternity, they responded that no one had picked up. My confusion only deepened as I stood there, unsure of what to do next. I radioed back, asking them to check who was supposed to be staying in the room. Again, it felt like a painfully long wait before I got a response. When they came back to me, I was told that no one had booked the room for the night. I stood there, my mind racing. No one was supposed to be in that room. I took out my security key card and opened the door. The room was empty, clean, and unused. It looked like it hadn't been touched in days. I searched every corner, trying to find any sign of what had happened, but found nothing until I walked over to the phone on the nightstand. I turned it over to check the serial number, then headed back to the lobby, my heart pounding in my chest. I accessed the hotel's security records to check the timestamps of calls that had been made from that room. Sure enough, there was a record of an active call, one that I had answered about 15 minutes earlier. The hotel didn't record calls, so there was no way to trace the caller, but it was clear that someone had been in that vacant room without permission. The realization hit me hard. I didn't know who had called or how they had gotten access to that phone, but it didn't feel like a coincidence. Something was off. Over the next few days, the situation became even stranger. The following morning, one of the guests staying on the same floor reported a family member missing. The missing person's family had stayed in a separate room, and they hadn't heard from them in hours. We reviewed the security footage of all the entrances and exits. The missing person was last seen leaving the hotel alone a couple of hours before the call I had received. It was unsettling. The timing, the location, it all seemed to align with the strange call I had gotten. It's still unclear if the two incidents are connected, but the more I think about it, the more suspicious it seems. The caller's description, although brief, sounded to me like someone who might have been involved in a forced kidnapping. The caller was never identified, and the missing person has still not been found. I can't help but wonder who they were. What happened to them? Was the call a cry for help? And who was behind it? It's a mystery that still lingers in my mind, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever happened that night is far from over.